Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining. We are delighted to have Dr. Brewer with us for the next hour or so talking about The Hunger Habit, his new book. But before I say a little bit more about Jud and more formally introduce him, I just have a couple of announcements just in case we don't have time at the end. So the first is that in April, each Wednesday in April from 6:30 to 7:15, Kel Juilliard is going to be offering a series based on the hunger habit. So really the kind of practical application of the hunger habit. And this, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can join. So these sessions will be live and you can join all of them live. You could join one live and see the other on our website. So you have lots of options in terms of how to do that. There is no charge for this. And while I'm at it and I have your attention, I also want to let you know about our Living Well at Home program. So these are virtual wellness classes, and we started these 4 years ago, right when the pandemic started. So we have yoga and nutrition, various fitness classes, mindfulness sessions, and they're all available to anybody. So you do not have to be a member. They're available and open to anybody. So my name is Tara Healy, and I am the program director of MindtheMoment, which is the mindfulness program of Point 32 Health. And it is our pleasure to welcome Jud. Jud has been a friend of our program for many, many years. We started our program back in 2005, and we've collaborated with Jud. He and I have taught together, and it's really wonderful to have him back. So let me say just a little bit more about Jud. Jud is an MD, PhD, a New York Times bestselling author, and a thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery. As a psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for treating addictions, Jud has developed app-based treatments for anxiety, emotional eating, and smoking, published numerous peer-reviewed articles. He has trained U.S. Olympic athletes and coaches, foreign government ministers, and corporate leaders. His work has been featured on 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, the BBC, NPR, and more. And finally, Dr. Brewer is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also serves as an associate professor in behavioral and social sciences at their School of Public Health. So welcome, Jud. We are so happy to have you for the next, say the next 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. So we will leave, some time at the end for questions, but I am going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to turn my camera off and put myself on mute, and you can take it away.
Great. Thanks, Tara. It's good to be here with you all. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So what I'm going to do is give a bit of a presentation that kind of gets at some of the background behind in the background research of how I wrote the hunger habit. Let's get to that right now. And then, as Tara said, we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you've got any, you can pop them in the chat at any time. And then we'll take a look at those at the end. Okay, so this should work. Oh, just some preliminaries. As a university employee at Brown, my lab has had the great opportunity to collaborate with a company called Mind Sciences. At the time, now it's part of a company called ShareCare that owns the apps that we've studied. So these conflicts of interest are all managed by Brown University's Conflict of Interest Committee. Also, I get royalties from books, so I wanted to mention that as well. As Tara mentioned, the Unwinding Anxiety book, and then the focus of the talk today, The Hunger Habit, which just came out in January. So I want to start with a story of a patient that I saw. It's interesting. I wrote about him in my Unwinding Anxiety book under the pseudonym Dave, and at the time, he wasn't sure if he was comfortable with me using his real name. due to employment, concerns and things like that. And he has done so well with his anxiety and actually his eating in the hunger habit. He agreed to have me use his real name. So if you read that book, his name is Rob. And so Rob came to me, this is pre-pandemic, so 5, 6, 7 years ago now. And it was actually, he came to me because of anxiety. And he said that, he'd get panic attacks driving on the highway and all of this. He was about 40 years of age at the time. And basically he met all the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder. And the reason I'm talking about him today with regard to eating is that he actually described how he would form, he started getting panic attacks when he was in 5th grade. And that started to become associated with eating. And I'll unfold that story a little bit as we go. And I use this cartoon here because, he came to see me because his anxiety was so bad that he couldn't even drive on the highway. And the best medications that we have available for treating anxiety help about 1 in 5 people. The technical term is number needed to treat. It's 5.2, meaning you need to treat 5.2 people before one person shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So anxiety medications can be helpful for some, but not for everyone. So I actually started getting anxious about how to help my anxiety patients, playing the medication lottery, didn't know which one of the next 5 was going to benefit and what to do with the other 4. Now in Rob's case, severe anxiety, had it for 30 years, but he also was at a very unhealthy weight. He weighed about 400 pounds when he came to see me. And I'm showing this obesity, and I'm going to call this clinical obesity because I just want to highlight how obesity can be stigmatizing for people. And the medical field is scrambling to catch up with using and learning and using better terminology to help identify when somebody is at an unhealthy weight versus, being fat or obese and not having any health problems, and that not being a problem. And so as a society, we've really struggled. We've had these, this stigmatization, this fat shaming, fat stigma, et cetera, for decades and decades. And so I don't want to perpetuate that even with this slide that was probably developed by a medical professional. But the highlight here is if you go look at green and purple, green is, green light is good in terms of healthy weights, and purple is not so good. And so despite knowing all that we know, in medical school, I learned this formula, calories in, calories out. We know that if we have fewer calories go in and we have more calories go out, so we eat the salad instead of the cake and we exercise, we're going to affect, our health in a good way, typically. But the problem is, as is attributed to Einstein, is that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And what I mean by this is the dominant paradigm is use your willpower, whether it's Weight Watchers, whether it's any fad diet, just grit your teeth and do it, as the Nike slogan says. But what we're starting to see, and one of the faces of willpower over the last number of decades was Oprah, where, she openly talked about struggling with her weight. And now she says, no amount of willpower is going to control this. And so what I want to highlight today is that we really haven't paid enough attention to how our brains work. And if we can actually learn how our brains work, we can learn how to work with our brains so that we can change unhealthy eating habits without willpower. That's a strong and bold claim, but I'm going to walk you through some science that suggests that this might actually work. And it starts with this question of how much do I actually know how my brain works? So I'm going to give you a little teaser, a trailer, which is a Weight Watchers commercial that came out 10 years ago now and was quickly pulled from television. And we speculate as to why it was pulled after you've watched this 1-minute commercial. and I love this. Not only there's a lot of humor in it in some of those scenes, but somebody uh, on that team really understood how the mind worked. You know, if you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack. So I spoke with one of the Weight Watchers CEOs after this, after this commercial, a couple of years later, and she said that it almost, in her words, almost tanked the company because people were saying, "Yeah, that's so true," and Weight Watchers wasn't helping them. Just use your willpower, and at the time I think it was, you can eat a certain number of points. It doesn't even matter what it was. And Oprah was famous one day for reporting that all of her points, all of her calorie points in one day came from alcohol, which I would not recommend. So what are we talking about here? What we're talking about here is that we've got, from a heuristic standpoint, so this is a little overly simplified, but the idea is we've got these survival systems in our brains, and we've got this, the younger and the weaker part of the brain from an evolutionary standpoint, the prefrontal cortex. So the youngest part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed, when we get hungry, when we get lonely, when we're tired, all these things. So you can see how it might be a challenging proposition to, put all of our eggs in the basket of the prefrontal cortex when it's the first part of the brain that's going to go offline when we're hungry. And that commercial really highlighted how we start to associate eating with moods. So that mood-food relationship starts to get developed. And so we learn to eat in the absence of hunger, in addition to when we're actually hungry. And the technical terms for this are positive and negative reinforcement. I'm using smoking and eating as examples because they follow similar pathways. So for the positive reinforcement to happen, let's say you can, from the commercial, you can see the kids won the Little League baseball game and they went out for pizza. And so they felt good for winning, and you can see that, oh, this feels good. I have an urge to eat some more pizza, and maybe they eat beyond what they actually need. This goes back and says, hey, next time you win a game or it's time for celebration, have some food. On the other hand, as you could see from the team that lost, they went out for pizza to commiserate. And so unpleasant things, let's say we lose the game and we get yelled at by our boss, this doesn't feel very good. Our brain says, do something to make this go away. So we eat to distract, or as a lot of my patients describe it, numb ourselves. And then this gets reinforced through negative reinforcement. Negative, it can be a little confusing. This just means making something unpleasant go away. That's why it's called negative reinforcement, as compared to positive reinforcement being, keep a good feeling going. Now, from a scientific standpoint, it's helpful to understand these mechanisms so we can study them. And as a clinician, I also want to know how this works so I can help my patients. For example, my patients who want to quit drinking, there's this idea of avoiding people, places, and things that trigger them to drink, to which my patients say, duh, yeah, if I don't go in the bar, I'm less likely to drink. So we can see how that fits in this mechanistic pathway. With smoking, for example, we can substitute eating, candy or carrot sticks instead of smoking a cigarette. And so, either of these fit this pathway, but unfortunately, neither of them actually breaks the habit loop. Are you ready for this? Well, we have to eat to survive. So we can't avoid cues and we can't substitute behaviors. So we could certainly say, well, I'm not going to have ice cream in the house until I have ice cream in the house, or until I go past the ice cream shop and I just can't resist because I've been trying to restrict myself for so long. We're certainly in the season of Lent. My wife and I enjoy watching the movie Chocolat every Lent, just to remind ourselves this battle between willpower and the passions. It is such a wonderful movie that highlights this, set in a small town in France, where it's willpower versus the evil chocolate. So I'd highly recommend watching that during this Lenten season, whether you're Catholic or not, or Christian or not, I should say. So you can see the problems here that get set up in this habit loop, and we can actually simplify this down to its core elements. To form any habit, we need a trigger, a behavior, and a result. We think of this as a reward from a neuroscience standpoint, but basically what this does is set up memory where we can learn. And this was, this evolved, all the way back to the sea slug. So basically any organism can remember where food is. That's the positive reinforcement. See food, eat food, and then dopamine signal to the brain that says, remember where this is. We can also learn through negative reinforcements to avoid danger, right? See the danger, avoid the danger, dopamine spreads to the brain, says, remember where that area is, don't go back. So there's a lot known about eating and how our brains form habits. In fact, this great New York Times Magazine article that was then also preceded a book by, I think, Michael Moss. This really highlights all the ways that food-like objects are engineered to get us addicted. I like how they use the Doritos as cover art because my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion, had a headline that says Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient, right? And notice how the electric orange of the Dorito looks basically the same as the electric orange of the Cheeto. That is not by mistake. So these things are engineered for vanishing caloric density, for bliss points, all these technical terms that highlight how these things are designed not for nutrition, but for addiction. And we've seen over and over and over all the myriad articles about how hyper-processed foods are not healthy. This isn't limited, of course, to eating. Social media also engineered the same way. Literally thousands of people employed, and get bonuses for getting us more addicted to whatever it is, whether it's a food, whether it's a social media site or whatnot. So just to summarize all that background, what this highlights is that there's actually a whole lot known about how our brains work, and people leveraging this against us, it literally every day to get us more addicted to eating when we're not hungry. So, okay, I'm not going to stop there and say, good luck. What I'll say is, if we know how this process works, we can actually start to ask questions and say, how can we actually target these core mechanisms? And I'll give some examples with smoking and even with anxiety to show how these are common shared mechanisms that drive eating and all sorts of things. So my lab's been studying mindfulness and awareness for the last couple of decades. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Jon Kabat-Zinn put out a definition almost 4 or 5 decades ago, back in the 1970s, where he talks about paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. The way I think about mindfulness is it's about bringing this curious awareness in so that when we have an urge to smoke or eat or worry or whatever, instead of these, avoidance or substitution strategies, we can bring this wedge of awareness in so that we can start to notice the process itself. And I'll go through the science quickly, and then what I'll walk you through is a 3-step process. Is the 3-step process I walked through in the hunger habit. But you don't have to read the book. There's it's relatively straightforward. So we've got to become aware. So for example, I had a patient who'd been smoking 40 years when he came to see me, and we calculated the number of times he had reinforced this habit loop. Ready? 293,000 times. And he had no idea that this was a habit loop and how to break it. So he'd been smoking, pack a day for 40 years. That's a lot of cigarettes. And so just to give you an example of the power of awareness, I said, well, okay, you're smoking, just pay attention as you smoke. Often my patients get confused because they're like, did my doctors tell me to smoke? And the short answer is, well, I know they're going to go ahead and smoke. So let's leverage that and bring some awareness in and see what happens. We published an article now over 10 years ago suggesting that there's a lot of power to awareness. So for example, as people start paying attention when they smoke, here's what one person reported. This is somebody using our Crave and Equip program. Said, mindful smoking smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. And what this highlights is this reinforcement learning process is critically dependent upon how rewarding the behavior is. It's one term for this is called reward-based learning. So something's rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. If it's not rewarding, we're going to stop. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but I'll just summarize, put a placeholder here with Yogi Berra's quote where he says, you can observe a lot just by watching. Now, we observed something pretty interesting when we did a randomized controlled trial, seeing how well awareness helped people quit smoking. Ready for this? We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And I won't go into the mechanistic data, but we've studied how it was working as well. But the short answer is that we could find direct evidence that it was actually driving the switch of awareness in and breaking it, breaking that link between craving and smoking. We'll get into this a little bit when we get into the pragmatic part of the talk. So at the time, we were thinking, wow, that's 5 times, that's pretty good. And I was working at the VA hospital at the time. I was on a smoke-free campus, and I look out my window, and this was, 2012, 13. People were, starting to buy smartphones. And I'd look out in my parking lot because they were on a smoke-free campus, and the, patients are out there smoking cigarettes, looking at their phones. And so I started thinking, wait a minute, they don't learn to smoke or overeat in my office. Can I actually bring my office to them? So we started developing what are now called digital therapeutics, app-based training programs that help people with their with whatever the habit was that they were struggling with. So we developed one for smoking, one for eating, and then even one for anxiety. And the Eat Right Now program actually is now the first CDC recognized diabetes prevention program that's based in mindfulness because of the evidence behind it. We can also bring these, we give people bite-sized daily trainings that can help them learn how to map out these habit loops and then work with them. We can also pair this with online communities so we can support people as they go. And I now for almost 10 years, maybe 10 years now, I've been running live weekly Zoom meetings for anybody in the programs so they can ask questions, et cetera. So we can really help folks at scale. I'll give you an example of somebody using our Eat Right Now program. This is one of our early pilot testers. This is somebody who came to see me at my clinic who was at an unhealthy weight, and she was about 30 years of age. She reported that she'd been binge eating entire large pizzas in single sittings, 20 out of 30 days a month. And she'd been doing that for a long time. And what she described is that since she was about 8 years of age, she would eat as a way to numb herself when her mom would yell at her or otherwise basically emotionally abuse her. And so what we did was just map out this habit loop, and we found that this negative emotions, whatever it was that she would have, would lead her to binge. And as she put it, the reward was this temporary relief because she would numb herself. She had no idea how her mind worked. And so I mentioned this earlier. So we started bringing in this mindful awareness practice through this Eat Right Now program to help people start recognizing and working with their eating challenges. And I'll go into the stepwise process of how this works in a minute, but just to highlight some of the research that's been done behind it. Ashley Mason did a study now over 5 years ago showing that we get a 40% reduction in craving-related eating and a 35% reduction in eating to cope with negative emotions. And the point here is that you can work with the same process, whether it's smoking or eating. And I won't go into the research with our Unwinding Anxiety program, but even with anxiety, and we get significant results. But all of that is dependent on knowing how our brain works. So I'll summarize that in a minute on where we can use this pragmatically, but let's get into a little bit more of the neuroscience behind how our brain actually works. And I'm going to start with a story. I love this story. It's a tragic story, but it's a really good illustrative story of what our brains do. So if you don't recognize this person, this is Lola Jones, 3-time Olympian. And back in 2008, she was favored to win the hurdles at the Olympics. In fact, she made it through all the preliminary rounds. She was in the finals at the 9th of 10 hurdles in the lead. In an interview with Time Magazine after the race, she said, "I was just in an amazing rhythm. And then I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race." And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. She clipped the 10th hurdle and finished 7th, right, when she was going to win the race. And the point here is, as she put it, she was telling herself to make sure her legs were snapping out. She got in her way. She got in her own way. She got caught up in this thinking instead of just letting her body do its thing. So how often do we get caught up? Well, the short answer is very often. There was a study at Harvard showing that we tend to daydream about 50% of waking life. So we can get caught up in daydreaming, but that's easy to snap out of. We can get caught up in stress. Boy, wouldn't that be great if we could just say, hey, stop being stressed and snap out of that. A little harder. And then on the far end of the spectrum, addiction, continued use despite adverse consequences. That's the definition I learned in residency. We could even be aware that we're doing something and feel like we're completely out of control. So what does it feel like to get caught up in our experience? Well, maybe we can just take 5 seconds to do this together. So there was we're going to see if we can replicate a study that was published now 10 years ago. So just think back to the last time you were anxious or stressed or afraid. And if you can feel what into that situation and feel where you feel that anxiety or fear in your body, just kind of make a mental note of that. Where do you feel fear? Where do you feel anxiety? In this study, this group of researchers induced different emotions in people and had them report where they felt them. And here's what they found. So I'm going to show you some heat maps, meaning the more yellow the color, the more people reported the same area of the body. So with fear, fear was felt mostly in the chest, sometimes in the neck. You can see a little bit in the abdomen. Anxiety, very much the same. I think of anxiety as fear of the future. And so you can see those are virtually identical. With fear, if something is chasing us, to protect ourselves, we kind of make ourselves as small as possible to protect our vital organs. And so we can see that the feeling of fear is going to induce physical and mental contraction, that closing down to help us out. So keep that in mind, because we'll come back to this later in the talk. So if we can feel these things, and this happens at least 50% of waking life, or, close to 50% of waking life, this is what we tend to default to, whether it's daydreaming or worrying or getting stressed or whatever it is. And this default mode network highlights a number of brain regions that are connected. There are two hubs of the default mode network called the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, shown in yellow. And this network is involved in self-reference. It's been shown to be activated when we regret things that we've done in the past, when we worry about the future. And it's also been shown to be activated when we crave things. So I'll first show you this interesting study with adolescents where they found that just showing them their own Instagram feeds where some pictures got a bunch of likes, this activated their reward centers in their brain, the nucleus accumbens, but also activated their self-referential network, the posterior cingulate in particular, you can see here. And so there seems to be something rewarding about getting a bunch of likes on Instagram. Also gets activated when people who are addicted to cocaine are shown pictures of people smoking crack cocaine. Lights up like a Christmas tree when people are addicted to cigarettes are shown pictures of people smoking cigarettes. Same thing with gambling. And even with chocolate. I love this study. This is one of my friends, Dana Small, who did this for our PhD research, where she fed people their favorite chocolate in a PET scanner. And she used a PET scanner because they could actually move their mouth and not screw up the image. And what she found was that at the beginning of the study, people would report, wow, this is delicious. My favorite chocolate. I'm getting paid to eat chocolate. Somebody's hand feeding me chocolate. This is amazing. And she would keep feeding them and feeding them and feeding them. You can imagine how their ratings went. And it would get to the point where they would wonder what the heck they signed up for, because they're like, oh, eating more would make me sick. This is awful. Now, at both ends of the rating scale, at positive 10 and negative 10, people were lighting up their posterior cingulate cortex. And what this was highlighting, it's like that wanting, either wanting more or wanting this darn study to be finished, activated their posterior cingulate. Last piece here, the more we worry, the more we activate this default mode network. Now, why am I showing you all of this? Well, we started wondering what the heck was convergent here with all these different studies. And our working hypothesis now over 10 years old and still going is that this posterior cingulate gets activated when we get caught up in our experience. And part of this is that we can actually test this because the task of mindfulness training is not to get caught up in our experience, right? Get out of our own way. And so we've done a number of studies. I'll just show you one of them where we compared experienced versus novice meditators to see what their brain activity looked like. Long story short, when we looked across 3 different types of meditation in this study, we found that experienced meditators were decreasing activity in their hubs of their default mode network compared to novices. Blue means less activity in experienced meditators relative to novices. So here, they're not activating their default mode network, these hubs of the default mode network. So what that brain data suggests, what those brain data suggest are that we can, there are neural correlates of getting caught up in experience. And I haven't shown you this, but we've actually found in randomized controlled trials that we can target that hub of the default mode network, for example, with smoking. And, the more decreased activity we see in the posterior cingulate cortex, the more people are likely to cut down on their cigarette use. So we can see direct mechanisms between training in mindfulness, seeing these brain changes, and seeing clinical outcomes. So how do we get to these outcomes for ourselves? You don't need an fMRI scanner. You don't need, you don't need a whole lot beyond awareness. And what I mean by this, I'm going to walk you through these 3 steps, and then I'm going to give you the outline, and then we'll go through each of them individually, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the first step is we've got to be aware of the habit loop itself. The second step is exploring the results of the behavior. And then the third step is stepping out of the habit loop. And often for our programs, we use mindfulness practices to help people step out. But really all you need to remember is this. First step requires awareness. Second step requires awareness. Third step might be awareness itself. So what do I mean by this? Okay, first step, we got to recognize our habit loops. If we can't see that we're in a habit loop, we can't step out of it. That's the bottom line. Here's somebody describing their experience. They said, I understand why I go to food, to avoid or cover up or distract from the uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling. Behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. Yes. First step, gotta map out these habit loops. So in fact, that's what I had Rob do when he first came in to see me for anxiety. So I sent him home. It was actually with our Unwinding Anxiety app. And I said, hey, start mapping out your habit loops. And he said, okay, I think I can do that. So once we map out these habit loops, we can then shift to the second step. And I think of this as the beginning of the end, because there's a part of our brain that determines how rewarding a behavior is. It's called the orbitofrontal cortex. And we set up a reward hierarchy based on different parameters. So for example, if I eat broccoli and I eat some milk chocolate, from a survival standpoint, and chocolate has a higher caloric density. And so my brain's going to generally prefer milk chocolate to broccoli. Now, for me, if I eat dark chocolate, it's going to compare the milk chocolate to the broccoli. And, it's for me, it's a no-brainer. Dark chocolate definitely goes higher on the reward hierarchy. So we set up these reward hierarchies to basically make decisions efficiently throughout our days. If we had to relearn everything every day, we'd be exhausted by noon. And because this is such an essential pathway, you can mathematically model it. And the math isn't important here, but what I want to highlight is a couple of things. One is the equation's relatively simple, not very many terms. And two, the equation has nothing to do with the dominant paradigm in today's society, which is willpower, right? Just use your willpower and eat the salad instead of the cake. What this equation suggests is that behavior change is critically dependent upon one thing, which is awareness. For example, if let's say there's a chocolaterie that opens up in my neighborhood, and I go in and I'm looking at their mango habanero truffles. And I'm like, wow, that looks pretty good. And I eat a mango habanero truffle. I'm like, wow, that's the most amazing truffle I've ever had. My brain gives me what's called a positive prediction error, meaning that's better than expected. I get a dopamine spritz and I learn, hey, this is a good chocolaterie. They know what's going on. On the other hand, if I eat it and like my mouth is on fire for a day because they put in too much habanero, or it's like it tastes like cardboard, I get a negative prediction error that says, hey, this isn't so good. These folks need to keep going, keep practicing until they get it. I also learn, hey, this isn't such a great chocolaterie. So you can see with awareness, I'm going to learn. If I don't pay attention, I'm just going to, go through my day habitually. So knowing these equations, we can actually embed mindful eating exercises into, for example, our Eat Right Now app and study how long it takes for somebody to change a habit. You ready for this? And I'll tell you right now, it's not 21 days. That is an internet myth, which feel free to ask about that in the Q&A if you're curious, but that's not true, not based on science. So what it does take, and this is not days, this is number of times that people have used the craving tool as they were paying attention to overeating. And you can see it takes about 10 times for somebody to pay attention when they overeat for that reward value to drop below zero, and they shift their behavior. So not saying this is for everybody, and we can get into the details of how long it takes the individual to shift a habit, but this is critically dependent upon awareness. The more we pay attention, the more we see that that overeating doesn't feel good, the faster we're going to change that behavior. So that was a study of 38 people. We followed that up with a community sample of over 1,000, and you can see that this happens pretty quickly. Some people were reporting their experience, as this person put it. Dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun, I'm on to you, right? Or as this person put it, a shift is happening. I'm choosing more healthy foods. The sugary things are less attractive. Satiety is now coming into focus. I like this because it highlights two things. One, the sugary things are less attractive. It's not that I've been able to force myself to not eat sugary things. No, they're less attractive. This person's becoming disenchanted with their old behavior. And it also hints at the third step. But before we get there, let me just report how Rob did. So, comes in 400 pounds. Oh, by the way, he has steatohepatitis. Steatohepatitis. That's a mouthful. He's got a fatty liver. He basically pated his liver from eating a bunch of fast food. He's got hypertension related to his weight, and he also has obstructive sleep apnea. So he comes back 2 weeks after his first visit. He was supposed to map out his anxiety habit loops. He sits down, has this big grin on his face, and he says, hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I looked at him because I was pretty sure we hadn't talked about weight loss yet. And he said, yeah, we hadn't talked about weight loss. But I was mapping out my anxiety habit loops, and my habit loop was this: feel anxious, eat fast food to numb myself. And then he said, I started paying attention, mapping that out, and realized that eating fast food was actually contributing to my health anxiety because he knew it wasn't healthy. He was at an unhealthy weight. So he said, I just stopped doing it because he realized that this wasn't helping him. It was just making him more anxious. And so he lost 14 pounds in 2 weeks because he is paying attention and becoming disenchanted with that old fast food habit. He actually called it an addiction. So once we become disenchanted with our old habits, then we can start to become enchanted with new ones. And I think of this as finding rewards that are more rewarding. So what do I mean by this? Well, if we know how our brain works, right, these negative emotions lead us to eat or worry or smoke or whatever, we get this brief relief, but then it reinforces the habit loop. So what can we do instead? Here, I like this quote also attributed to Einstein. I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. You might be connecting the dots. Yes, curiosity is this key attitudinal quality of mindfulness, right? This mindful, this curious awareness. So we can start to substitute curiosity in for, stress eating or whatever it is. So, for example, if we have an urge to eat, we can do two things. We can either resist that urge. I guess we can do three things. We can either resist the urge, we can succumb to the urge, or we can get curious about that urge. So, what does it feel like to resist an urge? We struggle with it, we fight with it, we might hold it off for a little bit, but for most people, they eventually succumb to it. So, it just doesn't feel very good. Well, what's it like to get curious about an urge? Instead of, oh, I got to fight this, we can go, oh, what does this feel like? And we can operationalize that curiosity in the moment simply by noticing that mental voice in our head. Does it sound like the oh no, or does it sound like the oh, what does this feel like? And when we bring curiosity in, we can start to notice, oh, what am I getting from this? Oh, how much am I eating? Have I eaten enough? What does a craving actually feel like if we want to ride out a craving? I'll give a concrete example from my own experience. I used to be addicted to eating gummy worms. I read about this in The Hunger Habit, but the synopsis is that I started paying attention and I started realizing that gummy worms don't actually taste very good. And I also started to notice, oh, I would have to eat the whole bag because I was addicted to them. And so I started to get curious, what does this craving feel like? And I started getting curious, what do I actually get from eating gummy worms? Not a whole lot. So then I could start to get curious and ask, well, what else is going to, satisfy that urge for something sweet? And I started comparing them to eating blueberries. And so for for me, blueberries a bigger, better offer compared to gummy worms. They tasted good. I didn't get the sugar rush and hangover. Could sleep well. I didn't have to eat the whole container because the fiber content and all that didn't make me crave more. So this curiosity can be a superpower, not only in helping us see how unrewarding unhealthy habits are, but also how rewarding these healthy habits are. We can get curious. Oh, what's it feel like when I eat blueberries compared to eating gummy worms? Here's an example of somebody bringing their curiosity in. This person said, I decided to get a snack because I was tired. Even thinking about the reason for that craving is so much more than what normally happens automatically. So here's some curious awareness. But much better, I enjoyed 4 M&Ms. Yes, 4, and I was fine. I never, 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 ever was able to leave an open bag of M&Ms in my drawer my complete life before. This is so amazing. So here somebody is just noticing, paying attention, satisfying an urge, like, oh, I want some M&Ms. How many? Wow, 4 is enough. It reminds me of a patient that I had that used to eat an entire bag of potato chips at night. And so I asked her to just start paying attention as she would eat and see how many was enough. Are you ready for this? She would stop. She came back a couple of weeks later and she said, 2. All I needed was 2. And that probably was her salt quotient for a week. But she realized that, she could satisfy that urge for potato chips with just 2. And that one helped her not bring in God knows how many calories she was eating a night, but also, save her a bunch of money. Potato chips are expensive. And so that bag of potato chips would last a long time when she only ate 2 as compared to eating the whole bag. Here's one more example, and then we'll sum it up so that we'll have some time for questions. This person said, I'm trying to listen to my body, stopping eating when my body has had enough to eat rather than finishing what's on the plate. That's a bigger, better offer, stopping when we've had enough. And that also requires awareness. So just to sum this up, we can think of it this way. We might have this, or, this see the sweet and habitually eat the sweet. And then the result is, oh man, I wasn't really hungry, or I ate more than I needed. And so we just get stuck in this automatic pathway. Well, we can become aware of it and we can say, I'm going to force myself not to eat that. which at sometimes can, if we can resist, can result that can be aligned with our goals, but it doesn't feel very good. Well, what I'm suggesting, awareness could be another way. So we notice what the trigger feels like, notice what the urge is, bring that curiosity in, and substitute curiosity for resistance or succumbing to the behavior, leads to the results that are aligned with our goals, and it feels non-depleted and it feels expanding. Curiosity itself feels pretty good. So just to sum all of this up, we know how our brains work. Why don't we actually start to leverage this process, the same ancient learning system that evolved to help us survive? This is what causes the quote unquote problems. And we can actually tap into this simply by bringing and fostering curious awareness. So how'd my patients do? Obviously, if they didn't do that well, I probably wouldn't be bringing them up as examples. I just got an email a couple of weeks ago, literally, from this patient. And she said, I don't know if you remember me, but you saw me about 8 years ago. I just want to let you know, I think she had heard me on a podcast or something and said, hey, I lost over 100 pounds. I went to Everest Base Camp. It was one of my life goals. Writing a book, all these positive things that came from her learning to bring awareness. But I'll say, even after 4 months, I still remember this. When I was working with her, 4 months into treatment, she had stopped binging. And she said to me, I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. And, so this highlights how it's not about avoiding the obstacles. It's about having those obstacles, as Marcus Aurelius put it, what stands in the way becomes the way, right? We can learn to change our relationship to the pizza or to whatever it is. How'd Rob do? Well, he lost 14 pounds. He went on to lose over 100 pounds, and he's maintained those gains, slowly still losing weight over, more than 5 years ago now. Said it's the easiest weight loss he's ever had. And also, about 6 months into treatment, I was walking out of our School of Public Health at Brown University, which is on Main Street. Guy pulls up in the car, rolls down his window. It's Rob. I'm like, great, he's driving. Gives me this big grin and says, hey, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm headed to the airport to pick someone up. So just highlights how when we learn how our minds work, we can learn to work with our minds and even master them. So I'll just end with two more quotes. One is from this person using the program. What's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right has been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here, it feels like the reward is defined differently and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for lack of better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace. Or as Rumi puts it, he says, there's a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up, call it grace, whatever. Something wakes him, and he's no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. This is beautiful in many ways, but I just want to highlight how, going back to that neuroscience of this contraction around, protecting ourselves or worrying or getting caught up in a craving, as we learn to step out of our own boundaries, or as I think Hafiz put it, why, or maybe Rumi even, why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? So we create our own prisons, whether it's food rules and putting ourselves in food jail or whatever. We can actually step out of that and use that curiosity as a way to live into our experience, moving beyond these notions of self even. So I'll leave it there and just want to thank all the participants that helped us, all of the collaborators, and most of this work was funded by the NIH. Summarized in the Hunger Habit, again, not to be a shameless plug of self-promotion, but if you're interested in more details, you can read that. Or it's really, I've summed it all up here. There's nothing from the general principles that I've left out. So I'll stop there. If you remember nothing else, I love these instructions that Mary Oliver gives us. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it, right? So bring in that curiosity and share that with the world.
Okay, so have you heard from any patients who have returned to bad habits, and how do you help keep them on track?
That's a great question. So the first thing I'll say is nobody's increased smoking when I've had them pay attention. Nobody's increased overeating when I've had them pay attention. So I'm not sure that's what this question is, but it reminds me to highlight that, some people feel like it's really scary to step out of their food rules mentality if they've had that for a long time. So I just want to encourage folks. This is about stepping into our growth zone and out of our comfort zone. So it's going to be uncomfortable at first, but don't worry, because typically when we haven't been able to follow the food rules, we're going to be eating anyway. And so it's probably not stepping into territory that you haven't stepped into. It's just stepping into a different attitudinal territory. So this growth zone, saying, oh, okay, if I'm going to have this urge to eat, let me go ahead and eat and pay attention as I do that.
Mhm.
So I think this question, if I'm reading it right, is around like, oh, somebody might be doing well, and then they quote unquote fall off the wagon.
Mhm.
And so here, I see this all the time. So somebody might be on a streak where they're like, yeah, this is going really well, and then like, oh man, and I totally quote unquote crashed and burned.
Yeah.
To me, if we can learn from a situation, then does it actually count as crashing and burning? And what I mean
Mm.
by this is, well, we can all ask ourselves this: do I learn more when everything's going well? Or
Mhm.
do I learn more when I've tripped and, fallen down, so to speak? For
Mm.
me, I learn the most when things haven't gone according to plan. And so if that's true, then we can say, okay, I learn. So can we open ourselves to learning in every single situation? And if we can do that, is
Mhm.
there ever such a thing as two steps forward, one step backward? I would say no, because that step
Mhm.
sideways is actually something that might help us learn for the future.
Mhm.
So here I say, if somebody is kind of fallen back to an old habit, I say, great, you get to collect data from this and learn, because that's going to help create that more solid foundation so
Mhm.
that you're less likely to fall in that hole again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Judd, what do you recommend for practices to start to cultivate this kind of awareness and curiosity? Because I think, we know that whatever we incline the mind toward on a regular basis, that's where the mind is going to go. So if it's
Mhm.
reactivity, whatever, it's going to go there. So in a way, we're actually really learning to see that impulse,
Yeah.
to feel that impulse, to get curious about it. Are there practices that help us do that? And are you using mindfulness and awareness somewhat interchangeably?
Yeah. So let's start with that last piece. I think so
Yeah.
mindfulness is a concept. I try to get it really pragmatic. So what is mindfulness? It's about a curious awareness. So when I say curious awareness, conceptually that's mindfulness, but I like to stay pragmatic. So that people don't get confused, like, well, what does he mean by mindfulness? So curious awareness, I'll try to use that term most consistently, because then we know exactly what we're talking about. So the other piece that you were asking, how do we develop, yeah, are there practices for that? So here I would say the simplest and not necessarily like a lower practice or not as good practice is like, oh, I'm a good meditator because I sit on the cushion 45 minutes a day. I would say for all of us, developing a simple practice is around noticing what our mind, let's say the inflection of the voices in our minds, and is there an oh no versus an oh. So for example, we can, anytime there's food, we can check to see, is there an oh no, I have to not eat this, or I have to just noticing that oh no contracted quality of the mind is a mindfulness bell in that moment, or an awareness bell where we can go, oh, what does this feel like? And so I would say a really helpful practice for developing that curiosity, because curiosity is going to help us whether we're sitting to meditate or walking or eating a meal, right? Anytime that curious awareness can be helpful. I would say the practice is to develop and foster that curious awareness. And I've had people say, well, I don't know, I can't be aware or I can't be curious. And say, okay, that's a great opportunity to ask yourself, oh, what does it feel like not to be curious? Because we're already curious. Like, oh, what does it feel like not to be curious? So that's the one practice I would say, a bunch of mindfulness practices in the Hunger Habit book, but that's the one I would suggest is that just to, practice all the time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and in between snacks.
Can you explain the it takes 10 times metric? Does this mean that it takes roughly 10 experiences of applying mindfulness to start making definitive changes based on that mindfulness?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. So it's not 10 days, it's 10 times of paying attention. So for example, if somebody overeats, that's what the study was largely based on people who were in the habit of overeating. So when they were at a time when they were overeating, they had to pay attention and bring in and they used the craving tool so we could collect the data, but also it could help walk them through the mindful eating exercise. Somebody said if somebody's
It's,
interested in the book, sorry to be shameless plug
yeah,
yourself.
yeah, yeah.
They can just go to my website and it lists all the independent booksellers or Amazon or wherever people buy books. So if it's just drjud.com,
Mhm.
they can take a look there. So if they want to buy it from an independent bookseller, which I always, if folks like doing that, support your independent booksellers. You can do that. Probably also has the Amazon link as well.
Jud, thank you so much for your time today and such a wonderful presentation. Clearly, folks got a lot out of it. And any final words, Jud?
Stay curious.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.